within the foundational texts of civilization, the Bible stands as a singular anthology of the human spirit, a collection of narratives that have shaped the moral imagination of the world for millennia. It speaks of origins and endings, of epic failures and breathtaking acts of grace. The stories that follow have been selected from this sacred library, retold not as dusty relics, but as vibrant, living dramas that capture the essential, often agonizing relationship between God and humanity. They are cornerstones of a shared heritage, exploring the very essence of what it means to be flawed, to be faithful, and to be redeemed. In these pages, you will be transported to the dawn of creation, to walk with God in a pristine garden before a single act of disobedience forever alters the human course and exiles mankind east of Eden. You will stand with a lone patriarch as he builds a colossal ark to save his family from a world-drowning flood, witnessing a promise of renewal sealed by a rainbow. You will feel the tension of a father's faith tested on a lonely mountain with the chilling demand for his long-awaited son. And you will journey with a reluctant prophet who, after fleeing his commission, finds himself contemplating the surprising nature of divine mercy from within the belly of a great fish. The collection then moves into the era of the New Testament, not with a chronicle of events, but with the parables and people who defined the Christian message. You will hear one of Jesus's most powerful tales, a story of a lost son's reckless journey away from his home, and the boundless, waiting love of the Father who runs to embrace him upon his return. You will stand beside the movement's most passionate, yet fragile leader, Simon Peter, and watch his bitter denial, next to a courtyard fire, be transformed by a lakeside restoration that redefines failure as a prelude to grace. Finally, the story culminates in the central event of the faith, a brutal execution on a Roman cross, followed by a quiet, world-altering victory over the grave that turns a band of frightened disciples into the heart of a global movement. Each of these narratives serves as a mirror to our own humanity, asking the questions that echo through every generation. Can innocence, once lost, ever be restored? What does faith demand when faced with the unthinkable? Is there a love that can overcome our deepest failures? These are more than just stories. They are invitations to explore the landscape of the soul and to encounter the enduring power of a faith forged in trial, tragedy, and ultimate triumph. The silence of the Bethlehem Hills, the Bible, a collection of texts sacred to billions, is often remembered for its towering figures and epic miracles. Moses parting the Red Sea, David felling Goliath, Jesus healing the sick. Yet, nestled within its ancient pages are stories far more unsettling, narratives that speak to the darkest corners of human nature and the complexities of a society grappling with its own moral compass. These are not tales of triumphant faith, but rather harrowing accounts of its absence. The story that follows is one such account, drawn from the book of Judges, a period in Israel's history marked by chaos and the haunting refrain. In those days, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It is a story of a nameless woman, a Levite's concubine, whose tragic fate ignites a brutal civil war. It is a narrative that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, mob violence, and the catastrophic consequences of silence in the face of atrocity. In retelling this story, we are not seeking to simply recount historical events, but to delve into the emotional and psychological landscape of its characters, to imagine the whispers and the cries that have long since faded from the Bethlehem hills, and to understand how a nation, in its infancy, could so violently turn upon itself. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but it is a story that demands to be told, a stark reminder of the fragility of civilization and the enduring echoes of forgotten voices. The air in the hill country of Ephraim was thin and sharp, carrying the scent of wild herbs and the distant bleating of sheep. It was a land of rugged beauty, of terraced slopes and ancient olive groves that clung to the rocky soil with a stubborn tenacity. Here, a Levite, a man of the priestly tribe, had made his home. He was a man of some standing, though not of great wealth, and his life was one of routine and ritual, governed by the sacred laws he was sworn to uphold. Yet in the quiet solitude of his home, there was a disquiet, a silent tension that coiled between him and his concubine, a woman from the town of Bethlehem in Judah. She was never given a name in the histories, a ghost in her own story. Perhaps it was because her life was seen as secondary, an appendage to the man she served. Or perhaps, in the great, sweeping narrative of a nation, the intimate details of a single woman's heart were deemed too small a thing to record. But she had a name, whispered by her mother in the cool shade of a Bethlehem courtyard, a name that tasted of figs and honey on the tongue of a childhood friend. And she had a spirit, a will that chafed against the confines of her life with the Levite. Their discord was a quiet, simmering thing, a tapestry of unspoken resentments and unmet desires. The Levite, a man accustomed to the precise order of religious ceremony, found her spirit untamable, a wild thing he could not corral with rules and expectations. For her part, she felt unseen, a vessel for his needs and desires, her own longings left to wither in the arid landscape of their shared life. The specifics of their final argument are lost to time, a casualty of a history written by men. The ancient texts, in their stark brevity, say only that she was unfaithful, a single word that hangs heavy with judgment. But the truth, as is often the case, was likely a far more tangled vine of sorrow and misunderstanding. One sun-drenched afternoon, the fragile thread of their life together snapped. She packed a small bundle of her belongings, her hands trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilarating resolve. She was going home, back to the familiar embrace of Bethlehem, back to the house of her father. The journey was long and arduous for a woman traveling alone, but the dust of the road was a welcome balm to her restless soul. For 4 months, she lived in a strange limbo, suspended between the life she had fled and a future she could not yet imagine. Her father, a man of gentle heart, welcomed her without question, his love a soothing poultice on her wounded spirit. He did not press her for details, seeing in her shadowed eyes a story she was not yet ready to tell. And in the rhythms of her childhood home, amidst the scent of baking bread and the low hum of evening prayers, a fragile peace began to settle over her. But the Levite's pride had been stung. His concubine's departure was a public rebuke, a stain on his honor. And so, with a servant and 2 donkeys, he set out for Bethlehem, not with a heart full of contrition, but with a determination to reclaim what he considered his. When he arrived at the house of her father, he was greeted with a surprising warmth. The old man, eager to mend the rift and restore his daughter's position, welcomed him with feasts and fine words. For 3 days, the Levite was feted as an honored guest. He ate and drank, his anger slowly soothed by the generous hospitality. The woman, his concubine, watched him from a distance, her heart a tumultuous sea of conflicting emotions. There was a part of her that yearned for the familiar, for the semblance of a life she had known. But there was another, stronger part that recoiled at the sight of him, at the memory of all the ways he had made her feel small. On the 4th day, the Levite announced his intention to depart. But her father, ever the conciliator, pressed him to stay another night. "Refresh your heart with a morsel of bread," he urged, his voice laced with a desperate hope. And so they stayed. And again on the 5th day, the same scene played out, a gentle tug-of-war between the Levite's impatience and the father's placating hospitality. Finally, late in the afternoon of the 5th day, the Levite could be delayed no longer. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple as they set out on their journey back to Ephraim. The woman walked beside the donkey, her face a mask of resignation. The fragile peace of Bethlehem was behind her now, a distant memory swallowed by the encroaching twilight. As darkness fell, they found themselves near the city of Jebus, a stronghold of the Jebusites. The servant, a practical man, suggested they seek lodging there. But the Levite, his piety now inflamed, scoffed at the idea. "We will not turn aside into a city of foreigners," he declared, "who are not of the people of Israel. We will press on to Jibah, a city of the tribe of Benjamin, a place where they should have found welcome and safety among their own kinsmen." As they entered the city square, the last vestiges of daylight had faded, leaving the narrow streets cloaked in an inky blackness. They sat in the open square, a silent, weary trio, waiting for the customary offer of hospitality that was the sacred duty of every Israelite. But the doors of Jibah remained shut, the windows dark and unseeing. The city, it seemed, had turned its back on them. Finally, as the chill of the night began to seep into their bones, an old man, returning from his work in the fields, saw them. He too was from the hill country of Ephraim, a stranger in this land of his own people. His heart was moved with pity at the sight of the weary travelers. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice rough but kind. "And from where do you come?" The Levite recounted their journey, his voice heavy with the weariness of the road and the sting of their cold reception. The old man would not hear of them spending the night in the square. "Peace be to you," he said, his words a balm to their frayed nerves. "Let all your wants be my responsibility. Only do not spend the night in the square." He took them into his home, a humble dwelling filled with the scent of wood smoke and old leather. He fed their donkeys and brought them water to wash their feet. And as they sat and ate, a fragile sense of security began to settle over them. The horrors of the night, they believed, had been kept at bay, but the wickedness of Jibah was a festering sore, hidden beneath a thin veneer of civility. As they were making their hearts merry, a low rumble began to build outside the house, the sound of angry voices and shuffling feet. Soon, the house was surrounded by a mob of men, their faces illuminated by the flickering light of torches, their eyes gleaming with a perverse and predatory hunger. They pounded on the door, their fists a brutal, rhythmic drumbeat against the aging wood. "Bring out the man who came into your house," they roared, their voices a guttural chorus of depravity, "that we may know him." The old man, his face pale with terror, went out to them. "No, my brothers," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "Do not act so wickedly. Seeing that this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Look, here is my virgin daughter and his concubine. Let me bring them out now. Violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man, do not do this outrageous thing." It was a desperate, horrific calculus. A father offering up his own daughter to a pack of wolves to protect a male guest. The mob, their bloodlust now at a fever pitch, would not be reasoned with. They pressed in, their intentions clear. The Levite, his own life hanging in the balance, made a choice that would echo through the annals of Israel's history as a testament to the depths of human cowardice. He seized his concubine, the woman he had pursued across the miles, the woman whose spirit he had sought to tame, and pushed her out the door into the waiting arms of the mob. The door was bolted shut, and the sounds from outside became a symphony of unspeakable horror. Her cries, at first sharp and piercing, soon dissolved into a guttural litany of pain and terror. The Levite and the old man huddled inside, their silence a damning testament to their complicity. They did not intervene. They did not cry out. They simply waited for the dawn. All night long, the men of Jibah ravaged her. They took their turns, their grunts and laughter a grotesque counterpoint to her whimpers. They were not men, but beasts, their humanity stripped away by the intoxicating power of the mob. As the first blush of dawn began to paint the eastern sky, they cast her aside, a broken, used thing, and slunk back into the shadows from which they had emerged. She dragged herself back to the house, her body a canvas of bruises and blood. With the last of her strength, she reached the threshold, her hands stretching out as if to grasp the door that had been so cruelly shut against her. And there, in the cold, gray light of a new day, she collapsed and died. When the Levite opened the door in the morning, ready to continue his journey, he found her lying there, her hands on the threshold. "Get up," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Let us be going." But there was no answer. He nudged her with his foot, but she did not stir. He placed her body on the back of his donkey, a silent, tragic cargo, and set out for his home in Ephraim. When he arrived, he did not weep. He did not prepare her body for a proper burial. Instead, in an act of chilling and calculated fury, he took a knife and dismembered her body, limb by limb, into 12 pieces. He then sent a piece to each of the 12 tribes of Israel, a gruesome, silent messenger demanding vengeance. The response was swift and visceral. A wave of revulsion and outrage swept across the land. From Dan to Beersheba, the tribes of Israel gathered as one, their hearts united in a common sense of horror. 400,000 armed men assembled at Mizpah, their swords glinting in the sun, their faces set in grim determination. They sent messengers to the tribe of Benjamin, demanding that they hand over the men of Gibeah who had committed this atrocity. But the Benjamites, their tribal pride overriding their sense of justice, refused. They chose to protect their own, to shield the guilty from the consequences of their actions. They gathered their own army, 26,000 strong, including 700 left-handed slingers, each of whom could sling a stone at a hair and not miss. And so, the stage was set for a civil war, a conflict that would pit brother against brother, a bloody, self-inflicted wound on the body of a young nation. The first 2 battles were disastrous for the Israelites. The Benjamites, fighting with a fierce and desperate courage, slaughtered tens of thousands of their kinsmen. The Israelites wept before the Lord, their confidence shattered, their cause seeming to hang by a thread. On the 3rd day, they sought the Lord's counsel again, and this time the answer was different. They were to go up again, and this time victory would be theirs. They set an ambush around Gibeah, drawing the Benjamite army out onto the open field. Then, at a prearranged signal, a great cloud of smoke rose from the city, and the tide of the battle turned. The Benjamites, seeing their city in flames, were thrown into a panic. The Israelites, their spirits now buoyed by the prospect of victory, pursued them relentlessly, cutting them down in the fields and on the highways. By the time the sun set on that bloody day, the tribe of Benjamin had been all but annihilated. Only 600 men had escaped to the rock of Rimmon, a desolate, windswept fortress in the wilderness. In the aftermath of the slaughter, a great and terrible grief descended upon the Israelites. They had won the battle, but at what cost? They had nearly extinguished one of their own tribes, a gaping wound in the heart of their nation. "O Lord, the God of Israel," they cried, "why has this happened in Israel, that today there should be one tribe lacking in Israel?" The story does not end there. In a strange and convoluted series of events, the Israelites, bound by an oath not to give their own daughters to the surviving Benjamites, orchestrated the kidnapping of young women from another city to provide them with wives. It was a desperate, morally ambiguous solution to a problem of their own making. A final, unsettling chapter in a story that began with the quiet desperation of a nameless woman in the hills of Bethlehem. And so, the silence returned to the Bethlehem hills, a silence heavy with the memory of a woman whose life was a tragic footnote in the grand, violent history of a nation. Her story, a stark and brutal reminder of the darkness that can fester in the human heart, remains a haunting echo in the sacred texts, a testament to the devastating consequences of a world where everyone does what is right in their own eyes. The Unseen War for Dothan. Introduction. The annals of the Old Testament are replete with tales of grand armies clashing on dusty plains, of walled cities falling to the sound of trumpets, and of kings leading their people in righteous conquest. These are the stories of visible wars, of conflicts defined by sword and spear, by the tangible clash of iron and will. But woven into this epic tapestry are other, stranger conflicts, wars fought not on the battlefield, but in the unseen realms that lie just beyond our perception. These are battles of faith against fear, of spiritual insight against worldly power, and they often involve figures who are not kings or generals, but humble prophets. The story that follows is one such account, drawn from the second book of Kings. It is the story of the prophet Elisha, the successor to the fiery Elijah, and a moment when the veil between our world and the next was drawn back, if only for an instant. It is a narrative that unfolds not in the courts of power or amidst the clamor of a great siege, but on a quiet hilltop overlooking the small, unsuspecting town of Dothan. It is a story that reminds us that the most significant battles are often the ones we cannot see, and that true strength is not measured by the size of an army, but by the clarity of one's vision. The king of Aram, Ben-Hadad, was a man consumed by a simmering rage. His war against the neighboring kingdom of Israel was not going as planned. It should have been a simple matter. Aram was a regional power, its armies vast and well-equipped, its chariots a thundering tide of wood and iron. Israel, by contrast, was a perpetually troubled kingdom, smaller and often fractured by internal strife. Yet, time and again, Ben-Hadad's meticulously crafted plans were thwarted. His ambushes lay in wait on empty roads. His raiding parties descended upon deserted camps. His most secret strategies, whispered only in the secure confines of his own bedchamber, seemed to be known to the Israelites before his own generals were fully briefed. A paranoid suspicion began to curdle in the king's heart. There was a traitor in his court. A spy, a viper in his inner circle, was feeding information to the enemy. He summoned his commanders, his face a thunderous mask of fury. His voice, accustomed to commanding legions, echoed off the stone walls of his war room. "Which of you," he bellowed, his eyes scanning each man, searching for a flicker of guilt, "is for the king of Israel?" The commanders, loyal and bewildered, exchanged nervous glances. The air crackled with tension. To be accused of treason by Ben-Hadad was a death sentence. Finally, one of the officers, a man who had served the king for decades, dared to speak. He stepped forward and bowed low, his voice steady despite the palpable fear in the room. "None, my lord, O king," he said, his words clear and respectful. "It is not one of us. There is a man in Israel, a prophet named Elisha. He is the one who tells the king of Israel the words that you speak in your bedchamber." The king stared at his officer, his initial rage giving way to a grudging disbelief. A prophet, a desert mystic who could pluck secret thoughts from the very air. The idea was preposterous, an affront to the rational, brutal calculus of warfare. Yet, it was the only explanation that made sense. The consistency of Israel's foreknowledge was too perfect to be mere coincidence or conventional espionage. A dark, obsessive fascination took hold of Ben-Hadad. This Elisha, this man of an unseen power, was the true heart of Israel's resistance. He was not just an obstacle, he was the enemy. He had to be eliminated. "Find him," the king commanded, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. "Go and see where he is, that I may send and seize him." The royal spies were dispatched, fanning out across the land, their mission singular and urgent. Locate the prophet. It did not take long. Elisha made no effort to hide. He was not a man who lived in the shadows. His power did not come from secrecy, but from a source far greater. The report came back to the king. "He is in Dothan." Dothan, a small, unassuming town nestled on a hill in the northern reaches of Israel, overlooking the strategic Jezreel Valley. It was a place of shepherds and farmers, a quiet community far from the centers of power. It seemed an unlikely place for the fulcrum of a war to rest. But for Ben-Hadad, Dothan was now the most important location on earth. He spared no expense. Under the cloak of a moonless night, a great force was mobilized. A vast contingent of horses and chariots, the elite of the Aramean army, moved silently through the valleys. They were a river of steel and shadow, their purpose the capture of a single, unarmed man. By dawn, they had completely surrounded the small town. The morning sun rose to reveal a terrifying sight for the people of Dothan. Every road was blocked, every escape route cut off. The hillside glittered with the menacing points of thousands of spears, and the air hummed with the nervous energy of war horses. The iron ring was closed. The first to see it was Elisha's servant, a young man who had risen early to attend to his duties. He stepped out into the crisp morning air, and his blood ran cold. He stumbled back, his face ashen, his mind struggling to process the scale of the army that held them in its grip. He rushed to Elisha, his voice a panicked whisper. "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" he cried, his body trembling. He was a young man of this world, a man who understood the simple, brutal arithmetic of a small town versus a great army. And that arithmetic added up to certain death. Elisha, however, was a man of a different understanding. He looked at his servant's terror-stricken face with a calm, reassuring smile. His own heart was untroubled, his spirit at peace. He saw not the crisis, but the opportunity. He saw not the end, but the lesson about to unfold. "Do not be afraid," Elisha said, his voice a steady anchor in the young man's sea of panic. "For those who are with us are more than those who are with them." The servant stared at him, bewildered. What could he mean? There were two of them. Outside, there were thousands. He looked out the window again at the encircling host, at the impassive, determined faces of the Aramean soldiers. He saw only what was visible, and what was visible was overwhelming. The prophet's words sounded like madness, the desperate platitudes of a man in denial. Seeing the fear and confusion that still clouded his servant's eyes, Elisha knew that words were not enough. This was a moment that required not explanation, but revelation. He turned his face towards heaven, his expression serene. He was not speaking to his servant now, but to his God. "O Lord," Elisha prayed, his voice filled with a quiet authority, "please open his eyes that he may see." And in that instant, something shifted. The world, for the young servant, tilted on its axis. The veil of ordinary perception was torn away. He looked out at the hill again, and his breath caught in his throat. The scene was transformed. The space between them and the Aramean army was no longer empty. The entire mountain, from its base to its summit, was ablaze with a celestial fire, where before there had been only rocks and olive trees. There were now horses and chariots of fire, a divine army of staggering size and breathtaking brilliance. They were a host of pure light and power, their presence radiating an intensity that made the formidable Aramean army below seem like a collection of children's toys. The unseen legions of heaven stood guard, a silent, shimmering testament to a power that dwarfed any earthly force. The servant's fear was not so much banished as it was consumed, incinerated by the awesome reality of what he now saw. He finally understood. Elisha's math was not wrong. His own vision had simply been incomplete. As the Aramean soldiers began their advance up the hill, their confidence absolute, Elisha prayed once more, "Please strike this people with blindness." And again, the unseen power of God descended. A sudden, inexplicable confusion fell upon the Aramean force. Their vision clouded over, not with physical darkness, but with a profound mental bewilderment. They could see, but they could not comprehend. The world around them became a disorienting haze. The town of Dothan, their clear objective just moments before, now seemed unfamiliar. The path forward was lost in a fog of uncertainty. Elisha, the man they had come to capture, now walked out of the town and stood before them, completely unafraid. He moved among the soldiers, who looked at him with vacant, unrecognizing eyes. "This is not the way, and this is not the city," he told the bewildered army, his voice carrying the calm authority of a guide. "Follow me, and I will lead you to the man whom you seek." In their state of divinely induced confusion, They obeyed without question. This lone, unarmed Israelite seemed to be the only point of clarity in their muddled world. He turned and began to walk, and the entire Aramean army, the horses, the chariots, the thousands of elite soldiers, followed him like lost sheep following a shepherd. He did not lead them to a trap. He did not lead them into an ambush where the armies of Israel could fall upon them. He did something far more unexpected. He led them on a 12-mile journey south, straight into the heart of enemy territory, into the very capital of Israel, Samaria. He marched them through the main gates and into the central square of the city. Only then, when they were completely helpless, surrounded by the high walls of the enemy capital, did Elisha pray a final time. O Lord, open the eyes of these men, that they may see. The fog of confusion lifted from their minds as suddenly as it had descended. The Aramean soldiers blinked, their vision clearing. And then a wave of cold, stomach-churning terror washed over them. They were not in Dothan. They were in Samaria, the capital of the king they sought to destroy. They were trapped, defenseless, at the mercy of their sworn enemy. The king of Israel, Jehoram, could not believe his eyes. A significant portion of the Aramean army had been delivered into his hands without a single arrow being fired. He rushed to Elisha, his mind already calculating the immense military and political victory that had just fallen into his lap. "My father," he asked, his voice giddy with the prospect of slaughter, "shall I strike them down? Shall I strike them down?" It was the obvious move, the move any king of that era would make. To annihilate an enemy force delivered so miraculously into your power was not just an opportunity. It was a strategic imperative. But Elisha's ways were not the ways of kings. His was a war not of annihilation, but of revelation. He had not orchestrated this incredible event to spill blood, but to open eyes, first his servant, then the Arameans, and now his own king. "You shall not strike them down," Elisha commanded, his authority absolute. "Would you strike down those whom you have taken captive with your sword and with your bow? Set bread and water before them, that they may eat and drink and go to their master." The king, though stunned by the command, obeyed. A great feast was prepared. The Aramean soldiers who had come to kill were treated as honored guests. They were given food and water, their wounds were tended to, and their fear was replaced with a profound sense of bewildered gratitude. They had come as invaders and were being treated as brothers. The lesson was more powerful than any sword. It was a demonstration of a power and a confidence so absolute that it had no need for violence. After they had eaten and drunk their fill, they were sent away. They returned to their master, Ben-Hadad, with a story he could scarcely comprehend. They were the living proof of a power that could not be fought with conventional weapons. The war, for a time, simply stopped. The Aramean raiding parties did not trouble Israel again for a long while. A battle had been won, not by the sword, but by a shift in perception. A young servant had learned that the armies of God were greater than the armies of men. An invading force had learned that the mercy of their enemy was more disarming than their weapons. And a king had learned that the greatest victory is not to destroy your enemy, but to reveal to them a better way. The unseen war for Dothan was over, leaving behind not a field of corpses, but a legacy of awe. The price of Gilead. There are moments in the history of a people that are not glorious annals of victory, but deep, sorrowful wounds. They are stories of flawed heroes and impossible choices, where the lines between faith and folly, honor and tragedy, become irrevocably blurred. In the rugged, blood-soaked hills of Gilead, during the chaotic era of the Judges, such a moment was carved into the memory of the land. This was a time before kings, when Israel was a loose confederation of tribes, perpetually warring with its neighbors and often with itself. It was an age of charismatic leaders, or judges, raised up by God in moments of crisis. But these were not always paragons of virtue. They were men and women of their time, forged in violence and driven by passions, both noble and deeply flawed. This is the story of one such leader, a mighty warrior whose desperate ambition to save his people led him to make a promise that heaven itself would weep to hear kept. It is the story of Jephthah, the outcast son, and the terrible price he paid for victory. Jephthah's life began in the shadow of rejection. He was the son of Gilead, a man of some standing, but his mother was a prostitute. In the rigid, patriarchal society of ancient Israel, this fact was a brand upon his soul, a stain that could not be washed away. His father's legitimate sons, his half-brothers, grew up looking at Jephthah with a mixture of contempt and fear. He was a constant, living reminder of their father's transgression, and he possessed a strength and intensity that unsettled them. The fire in his eyes was not the steady flame of a hearth, but the wild, untamable blaze of a brush fire. The day their father died, the simmering resentment of his brothers boiled over. They confronted him, their faces masks of cold, legalistic righteousness. "You will not have a share in our father's inheritance," they declared, their words like stones. "You are the son of another woman." They drove him out. Cast aside by his own family, Jephthah fled from his home, an outcast with nothing but the clothes on his back and the burning resentment in his heart. He journeyed to the land of Tob, a frontier region on the wild eastern fringes of Gilead. It was a lawless place, a refuge for those who lived outside the bounds of settled society, the dispossessed, the debtors, the renegades. It was a land that suited Jephthah's spirit. Here, his reputation as a fierce warrior, already whispered about in Gilead, blossomed. He gathered around him a band of men much like himself, men with nothing to lose and everything to prove. They were not a formal army, but a brotherhood forged in hardship and shared exile. They became sellswords, raiders, a formidable fighting force renowned for their ferocity and their unwavering loyalty to their leader. Jephthah, the rejected son, had become a prince among outlaws. He honed his bitterness into a razor-sharp sword, and his pain into an impenetrable shield. Meanwhile, the land he had been forced to flee was falling into darkness. The Ammonites, a rival kingdom to the east, saw the disunity in Israel and began to press their advantage. They crossed the Jordan, their armies sweeping into Gilead, plundering villages and slaughtering the inhabitants. The Ammonite threat was not merely a border skirmish, it was a war of subjugation. The elders of Gilead, the very men who had stood by and watched as Jephthah was cast out, found themselves powerless. Their militias were scattered. Their people lived in constant terror. And the Ammonite encampment grew ever larger, a menacing shadow on their land. Desperation is a powerful motivator. It forces men to swallow their pride and seek help from the very places they once scorned. The elders of Gilead, their fine robes now dusted with the ashes of their burning fields, held a council. Their conclusion was both humiliating and unavoidable. There was only one man who could save them, only one man with the skill and the ruthless determination to stand against the Ammonites. They had to ask Jephthah for help. They journeyed to the land of Tob, a delegation of proud men forced to humble themselves before the outcast. They found Jephthah in his camp, surrounded by his loyal band of warriors. He watched them approach, his face an unreadable mask, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. "Come," the elders began, their voices strained with a feigned confidence. "Be our commander, that we may fight the Ammonites." A slow, mirthless smile touched Jephthah's lips. He let the silence hang in the air, forcing them to squirm under his gaze. He had dreamed of this moment, of seeing these men, who had considered him less than dust, come to him as supplicants. "Did you not hate me?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Did you not drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now when you are in distress?" The elders exchanged uneasy glances. They had no answer for his accusation, for it was the undeniable truth. Nevertheless, one of them stammered, "We have turned to you now. Come with us and fight the Ammonites, and you will be our head, our ruler over all the inhabitants of Gilead." Jephthah's mind raced. This was more than he could have hoped for. Not just a commander, but a ruler. The outcast would become the chieftain. The stone the builders rejected would become the cornerstone. But he was no fool. He knew the fickle nature of men who acted out of desperation. "If you bring me back home to fight the Ammonites," he said, his eyes boring into theirs, "and the Lord gives them to me, I will be your head." He was not asking. He was stating the terms of his contract. And he invoked the name of God, not as a pious utterance, but as the seal on a binding oath. The elders readily agreed. "The Lord will be a witness between us," they swore. "We will do as you say." So Jephthah returned to Gilead. The man who had been driven out in disgrace now rode at the head of a procession, hailed as a savior. At the sanctuary in Mizpah, the covenant was ratified before the Lord and the people. Jephthah, son of a prostitute, was now the judge and commander of Gilead. His first act was not to sharpen his sword, but to wield the tools of diplomacy. He sent messengers to the king of the Ammonites, seeking a peaceful resolution. "What do you have against me, that you have come to fight against my land?" he asked. The Ammonite king replied with a claim rooted in ancient history, stating that the land belonged to him, that Israel had stolen it from his ancestors centuries before. Jephthah, proving he was more than just a brute warrior, responded with a detailed and eloquent legal and historical argument, dismantling the king's claim and asserting Israel's right to the land, granted to them by their God. But his words fell on deaf ears. The king of the Ammonites would not listen. The path of diplomacy was closed. War was inevitable. It was in this moment, as he prepared to lead his people into a battle for their very survival, that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah. He was filled with a divine power, a sacred certainty of purpose. He passed through the lands of Gilead and Manasseh, gathering his forces, his presence inspiring a new hope in the hearts of a terrified people. And then, on the eve of the battle, standing before his assembled army, with the fate of his nation resting on his shoulders, Jephthah did something that would forever define his legacy. He looked up to the heavens, his heart pounding with a mixture of faith and desperate anxiety, and he made a vow. "If you will give the Ammonites into my hand," he cried out, his voice ringing across the camp, "then whatever comes out from the doors of my house to meet me when I return in peace from the Ammonites shall be the Lord, and I will offer it up for a burnt offering." It was a rash vow, a terrible and unconditional promise born of a deep-seated insecurity. It was the desperate gamble of a man who, despite the Spirit of God being upon him, still felt the need to bargain with the divine. He was the outcast who still felt he had to earn his place, not just with men, but with God himself. He did not ask for a sign. He named the price of victory himself, a blind offering from his own life. With the vow made, Jephthah led his men into battle. The clash with the Ammonites was fierce, but the outcome was decisive. The Lord gave them into his hand. Jephthah and his warriors utterly crushed the enemy, routing them from 20 cities in a great and bloody slaughter. The Ammonite threat was broken, and Gilead was saved. Jephthah returned not just as a commander, but as a conquering hero. As he approached his home in Mizpah, the sounds of celebration preceded him. The people poured out into the streets, cheering his name, singing songs of his victory. Jephthah's heart swelled with a pride and vindication he had craved his entire life. He had done it. He had saved his people. He was their ruler, their hero. He had finally found his home. And then he saw her, dancing out from the doors of his house to lead the celebration. To be the first to greet her conquering father was his daughter. She came with timbrels and with dancing, her face alight with joy and pride. She was his only child. Besides her, he had neither son nor daughter. The world stopped. The cheers of the crowd faded into a dull roar. The vibrant colors of victory turned to a monochrome of horror. The man who had faced down an entire army, the warrior who had never flinched in battle, crumpled. He tore his clothes, the ritual gesture of ultimate grief and despair, and a raw, guttural cry was ripped from his soul. "Alas, my daughter," he wailed, the words tearing through the celebration like a funeral dirge. "You have brought me very low. You have become the cause of my trouble. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take it back." His daughter, her dance cut short, her timbrel falling silent, looked at her father's devastated face. She saw not a hero, but a broken man. And in his words, she understood the terrible truth. He explained the vow, his voice choked with a grief so profound it was almost madness. And in that moment, this young woman, whose name is also lost to history, showed a courage and a sense of honor that eclipsed her father's military victory. There was no pleading, no begging for her life. She saw the vow not as her father's folly, but as a sacred debt that had purchased the salvation of her people. Her duty, as she saw it, was clear. "My father," she said, her voice quiet but firm, unshaken in the face of her own demise, "you have opened your mouth to the Lord. Do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has avenged you on your enemies, the Ammonites." She had only one request. "Let this thing be done for me," she said. "Let me alone for 2 months, that I may go up and down on the mountains and weep for my virginity, I and my companions." It was a plea not to escape her fate, but to mourn the life she would never have, the life of a wife, a mother, the continuation of her family line. For a woman in ancient Israel, to die childless was a tragedy in itself. Jephthah, his heart shattered, could only agree. "Go," he whispered. For 2 months, she wandered the mountains of Gilead with her friends. Their weeping was the only sound in those high, lonely places, a lament for a life cut short by a father's rash promise. It was a period of mourning not just for her, but for the future of Jephthah's own house, which would now die with him. At the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father. She had faced her fate with a dignity that was both heartbreaking and awe-inspiring. And Jephthah, bound by the chains of his own making, did to her according to the vow he had made. The hero of Gilead, the savior of his people, sacrificed his only child on an altar of his own pride. The story concludes with a simple, haunting custom. It became a tradition in Israel that the daughters of Israel would go year by year to lament the daughter of Jephthah the Gileadite, 4 days in the year. It was not a celebration of victory, but an annual ritual of sorrow, a national scar left by the terrible price one man paid to secure his place in the world. He won the war, he became the ruler, but in the end, he lost everything that mattered. His house was left desolate, a silent monument to a tragic and avoidable vow. The 14th night in the Adria, in the grand tapestry of faith, some of the most profound threads are spun not in the solemn quiet of a temple, or on a mountaintop ablaze with divine fire, but in the heart of a raging storm, on the splintering deck of a ship surrendering to the sea. The tales that resonate most deeply are often not about the absence of fear, but about the presence of an unshakable hope in the very midst of it. This is one such story, a gripping chapter from the life of the Apostle Paul. It is a narrative stripped of tranquil stained glass imagery, plunging us instead into the foam and fury of the Mediterranean, onto a vessel carrying a cargo of grain, soldiers, sailors, and one indomitable prisoner. It is a story about the clash between imperial power and spiritual authority, between expert opinion and divine revelation, and how, when the anchors of human reason fail, faith can become the only thing that holds. The autumn winds were turning treacherous. On the southern coast of Crete, the port of Fair Havens offered a grudging, inadequate shelter, but shelter nonetheless. The ship, an Alexandrian grain freighter, was already behind schedule. Its destination was Rome, the heart of the empire, and its most important passenger was a prisoner, Paul of Tarsus. He was being transported under the guard of a centurion named Julius, a man of the Augustan cohort, who, against the usual Roman disposition, had developed a quiet respect for his shackled charge. Paul, a seasoned traveler who had crisscrossed the Roman world, felt the change in the air. He knew the moods of the Mediterranean, the sudden, violent temper that could rise from its turquoise depths once the sailing season had passed. He approached the ship's captain and its owner, with Julius listening intently nearby. "Sirs," Paul said, his voice calm but urgent, "I can see that our voyage will be disastrous and bring great loss to ship and cargo, and to our own lives also." Ship's owner, with a season's profits at stake, scoffed. The captain, a man who trusted his own experience over the premonitions of a religious mystic, was equally dismissive. Why winter in a place as inconvenient as Fair Havens? A short sail west along the coast would bring them to Phoenix, a much better provisioned harbor to wait out the coming storms. It was a calculated risk, a gamble on a favorable wind. Julius, the centurion, was a soldier, not a sailor. He deferred to the experts. He trusted the captain's seasoned judgment over the prisoner's strange warning. The decision was made. A gentle southerly breeze, a soft and seductive lyre, sprang up as if to endorse their choice. It seemed a perfect opportunity. They weighed anchor and sailed out from Fair Havens, hugging the Cretan coast. A sense of relief settled over the 276 souls on board. The prisoner, they thought, had been wrong, but the Mediterranean is a fickle beast. The gentle breeze was merely the deep breath before the roar. Without warning, a wind of hurricane force, a northeaster the sailors called the Euroclydon, screamed down from the mountains of Crete. It struck the ship with the force of a battering ram. The massive vessel, laden with grain, was instantly at the mercy of the tempest. The captain's confident control vanished in a maelstrom of wind and spray. They could not hold their course. They could do nothing but surrender to the storm and be driven. The sky, a brilliant blue just hours before, became a churning cauldron of bruised purples and angry grays. Waves, monstrous and relentless, crashed over the decks, sweeping away anything not lashed down. Below, the The ship's timbers groaned in protest, each creak and shudder a sound of impending doom. Panic, cold and sharp, began to set in. Under the direction of the frantic captain, the sailors managed to haul the ship's small lifeboat, the skiff, on board, a desperate task that left them bruised and exhausted. They then began to undergird the ship, passing heavy cables under the hull to try and hold its straining frame together. Fearful of being driven onto the notorious sandbanks of the Pleiades off the coast of Africa, they lowered the sea anchor, a device intended to slow their wild, uncontrolled drift. For days, the storm raged without ceasing. The sun and stars, the ancient tools of navigation, disappeared completely, leaving them adrift in a blind, violent world. All sense of direction was lost. They were a tiny, insignificant speck tossed on an infinite, furious sea. To lighten the ship, they began to throw the cargo overboard. Bales of precious grain, the wealth of Egypt bound for Rome, were heaved into the churning waves. The next day, in an act of ultimate desperation, they jettisoned the ship's own tackle with their bare hands, ropes, spare sails, anything that had weight. As the days bled into one another, hope began to die. The relentless violence of the storm, the constant, gut-wrenching motion of the ship, and the gnawing fear of a watery grave wore them down. No one ate. The thought of food was nauseating, and the effort required was too great. A profound, soul-crushing despair settled over the ship. The soldiers, the sailors, the prisoners, all were leveled by the storm, their ranks and stations rendered meaningless in the face of imminent death. They were simply a collection of drowning men on a dying ship. In the midst of this hopelessness, one man remained a pillar of calm. Paul, the prisoner, had been praying. On the 14th night of the storm, as the exhausted men huddled together in the darkness, he made his way to the center of them. He was pale and gaunt from lack of food, but his eyes held a light that defied the tempest. "Men," he said, his voice carrying over the howl of the wind, "you should have listened to me and not have set sail from Crete and incurred this damage and loss. But now I urge you to keep up your courage, because not one of you will be lost. Only the ship will be destroyed." The men stared at him, their faces gaunt in the flickering lamplight. Was this madness? How could he speak of courage now, when the ship was clearly breaking apart beneath their feet? Paul continued, his voice resonating with an unshakable conviction. "Last night, an angel of the God whose I am, and whom I serve, stood beside me and said, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand trial before Caesar, and God has graciously given you the lives of all who sail with you. So keep up your courage, men, for I have faith in God that it will happen just as he told me. Nevertheless, we must run aground on some island. A promise." In the heart of chaos, Paul delivered a promise from a God most of them did not know. A promise of survival, but one that included the terrifying certainty of a shipwreck. It was a strange, paradoxical hope, but it was hope nonetheless. A seed of it began to sprout in the barren soil of their despair. Around midnight on that 14th night, the the sailors sensed a change. The sound of the waves seemed different. They suspected they were approaching land. They took soundings, dropping a weighted line into the black water. The first measurement showed a depth of 20 fathoms, 120 feet. A short time later, they measured again. 15 fathoms, 90 feet. They were rushing towards land in the dark, and the water was getting shallower with terrifying speed. Fearing they would be dashed against a rocky shore, they threw 4 anchors out from the stern, a desperate maneuver to halt the ship's forward momentum. And they prayed for daylight. The sailors, however, had their own plan. Believing the ship was doomed, they saw their only chance of survival in the lifeboat. Under the pretense of putting out more anchors from the bow, they began to lower the skiff into the churning sea, intending to abandon the passengers and soldiers to their fate. Paul saw their deception. He turned to Julius the centurion and the soldiers. "Unless these men stay with the ship," he said calmly, "you cannot be saved." Julius did not hesitate. The prisoner had been right before, and the centurion's trust was now absolute. On his command, the soldiers drew their swords, strode to the side of the ship, and cut the ropes holding the lifeboat. The small skiff, the sailors' treacherous hope, was swallowed by the waves and disappeared into the night. Now they were all in it together. Salvation would be for everyone or for no one. As the first faint hint of dawn began to lighten the eastern horizon, Paul once again addressed the weary, terrified crowd. "For 14 days you have been in constant suspense and have gone without food. You haven't eaten anything. Now I urge you to take some food. You need it to survive." To set the example, he took some bread. In the midst of the shivering, frightened men on the deck of a ship straining at its anchors and expecting to be smashed to pieces at any moment, Paul gave thanks to God. He broke the bread and began to eat. His calm, practical action was more powerful than any sermon. A wave of renewed courage washed over the men. If this man could give thanks for a piece of bread at a time like this, perhaps there truly was a reason to hope. Encouraged, they all took food, the first they had eaten in 2 weeks. Their strength, both physical and spiritual, began to return. When daylight finally broke, they saw it land. But it was an unfamiliar coastline with a bay and a sandy beach. Their plan was simple and desperate. They would cut the anchors, untie the rudder ropes, raise the small foresail to the wind, and try to run the ship aground on the beach. They cut the anchors, and the sea claimed them. The ship, freed from its restraints, surged forward, but their plan went awry. The ship struck a sandbar, an underwater shoal. The bow stuck fast, held in an unyielding grip. The stern, however, was still exposed to the full, violent force of the surf. With a series of sickening, splintering cracks, the back of the ship began to break apart. The soldiers' training and instinct took over. Roman military procedure was brutal and unforgiving. If a prisoner escaped, his guard paid with his life. Their immediate response was to kill all the prisoners on board to prevent any from swimming away in the chaos. But Julius, the centurion, stepped in. His primary concern was no longer Roman military protocol, but the life of the man who had saved them all. To save Paul, he commanded the soldiers to stand down. He then ordered all who could swim to jump overboard and make for the shore. The rest were to follow, grabbing onto planks and other pieces of the broken ship. And so, in a chaotic scramble of swimming, kicking, and clinging to floating debris, every single person made it safely to shore. They collapsed onto the beach, exhausted, soaked, and freezing, but alive. 276 souls. Not one was lost, just as the prisoner had promised. They soon learned the name of the island that had been their salvation, Malta. The 14th night in the Adria was over. They had survived the storm, and a new chapter on a strange and hospitable shore was about to begin. The wisdom of Carmel, the wilderness of Paran, is a crucible. It is a land of baked earth and brittle shrubs, of sharp rocks and unforgiving sun. It strips a man down to his essence, boiling away pretense and leaving only what is true. For David, son of Jesse, it had become both refuge and prison. He was the anointed king of Israel, the celebrated hero who had slain Goliath. Yet he was also a fugitive, hunted by the man who still sat on the throne, King Saul. David was not alone in his exile. Around him had gathered a band of 600 men, a motley assembly of the desperate, the indebted, and the discontented. They were a private army of outcasts, their loyalty to David absolute, their swords sharp, and their stomachs perpetually empty. In their wanderings, they had become a protective shadow over the vast pasture lands bordering the desert. They were a wall of unseen strength for the shepherds who grazed their flocks in those lonely, vulnerable hills. They deterred the Amalekite raiders and drove off the desert lions, asking for nothing in return. Their presence, a silent, brooding security. One of the greatest beneficiaries of this unpaid protection was a man named Nabal. He was a man of immense wealth, the owner of 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats, whose flocks fattened themselves on the grasses of Carmel, a town near Maon. But his wealth had not ennobled him, it had curdled his soul. The Bible, with its stark honesty, notes that he was surly and mean in his dealings. His name, Nabal, meant fool, and he lived down to it with every fiber of his being. It was the time of sheep shearing, a season of hard work followed by raucous celebration and feasting. It was a time when generosity was expected to flow as freely as wine. David, hearing that the fool of Carmel was shearing his sheep, saw an opportunity. His men were in need, and their service to Nabal's shepherds had been long and faithful. He dispatched 10 of his young men with a message of peace and a polite request. "Go up to Carmel and greet Nabal in my name," David instructed. "Say to him, 'Long life to you, good health to you and your household, and good health to all that is yours. I hear that it is sheep shearing time. When your shepherds were with us, we did not mistreat them, and the whole time they were in Carmel, nothing of theirs was missing. Ask your own servants, and they will tell you." Therefore be favorable toward my men, since we come at a festive time. Please give your servants and your son David whatever you can find for them." The request was steeped in the honor codes of the East. It was part payment for services rendered, part appeal to a wealthy man's festive generosity. The 10 young men traveled to Nabal's bustling estate and delivered their message word for word. Nabal, likely flushed with wine and self-importance, listened to them with a sneer. He looked at David's dusty messengers as if they were insects. "Who is this David?" he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. "Who is this son of Jesse? The land is full of slaves these days who break away from their masters. Why should I take my bread and my water and the meat I have slaughtered for my own shearers and give it to men who come from who knows where?" The insult was calculated and profound. He had not only refused the request, he had publicly denied David's identity, mocked his lineage, and branded him a runaway slave, the lowest possible status. He dismissed the future king of Israel as a common vagrant. The 10 young men, their faces burning with humiliation, turned without a word and journeyed back to David. They reported everything Nabal had said. The effect was like throwing a torch into a barrel of oil. David's face, so often compassionate or lost in thought, became a mask of cold fury. The poet vanished, and the warlord emerged. He had offered peace and been answered with contempt. His honor, the currency by which a leader of men survived, had been trampled in the dust. "Put on your swords," he roared to his men. The command echoed through the camp, and the grim sound of steel being strapped to hips followed. 400 men, a lethal force of hardened fighters, prepared to march. David strapped on his own sword, his eyes glinting with a terrible resolve. "It's been useless, all my watching over this fellow's property in the wilderness, so that nothing of his was missing," he vowed to his men as they began their march of vengeance. "He has paid me back evil for good. May God deal with David, be it ever so severely, if by morning I leave alive one male of all who belong to him." While David and his men were marching north, breathing murder, a different kind of drama was unfolding back at Nabal's estate. One of the young shepherds, a man who understood the precarious balance of power in the wilderness better than his master, had witnessed the entire exchange. His heart seized with terror. He knew what Nabal's foolish pride had unleashed. He bypassed his master, knowing it was useless to speak to a fool, and ran to the one person who might be able to avert the coming catastrophe. Nabal's wife, Abigail. The Bible describes her simply as an intelligent and beautiful woman. It is a profound understatement. She was wisdom and grace bound in human form, a pearl inexplicably married to a swine. The servant burst in, his words tumbling out in a rush. "David sent messengers from the wilderness to give our master his greetings, but he hurled insults at them," he explained. "Yet these men were very good to us. They did not mistreat us, and we missed nothing all the time we were near them in the fields. Night and day, they were a wall around us. Now think it over and see what you can do, because disaster is hanging over our master and his whole household. He is such a wicked man that no one can talk to him. Abigail did not panic. She did not wring her hands or waste a moment in recrimination. Her intelligent mind assessed the situation with lightning speed. She understood the gravity of her husband's insult and the deadly nature of David's rage. She acted without a word to Nabal, who was by now deep in his cups at his feast. She moved with staggering efficiency. She commanded her servants to gather 200 loaves of bread, 2 skins of wine, 5 dressed sheep, a bushel of roasted grain, 100 cakes of raisins, and 200 cakes of figs. It was a massive gift, a clear and generous counterpoint to Nabal's stinginess. She had the provisions loaded onto donkeys and sent her servants on ahead of her. "I will follow you," she told them. Then, mounting her own donkey, she rode out to intercept a death squad. She took a path that wound down through a ravine. As she rounded a bend in the mountain pass, she saw them. David and his 400 men, a river of angry steel and grim faces, were coming toward her. David was at their head, his features set in stone, his mind fixed on the slaughter to come. The moment Abigail saw him, she slid from her donkey and bowed low to the ground, her face in the dust at his feet. It was an act of profound humility and respect, the exact opposite of her husband's arrogance. "My lord," she began, her voice clear and steady, not lifting her head, "let the blame be on me alone. Please let your servant speak to you. Hear the words of your servant." Her opening was a stroke of genius. She immediately took the guilt upon herself, creating a space for David's anger to be redirected. "Pay no attention to that wicked man Nabal," she continued. "He is just like his name. His name means fool, and folly goes with him. As for me, your servant, I did not see the men my lord sent." She then pivoted, lifting the situation from a personal insult to a matter of divine importance. "And now, my lord, as surely as the Lord your God lives, and as you live, since the Lord has kept you from bloodshed and from avenging yourself with your own hands, may your enemies and all who are intent on harming my lord be like Nabal." She was not just asking him to stop. She was telling him that God had sent her to stop him, to preserve his moral purity for the great destiny that awaited him. She presented her gift, not as a payment, but as a blessing for his men. And then, with breathtaking wisdom, she looked to his future, reminding him of his true calling. "The Lord will certainly make a lasting dynasty for my lord, because you fight the Lord's battles, and no wrongdoing will be found in you as long as you live. When the Lord has fulfilled for my lord every good thing he promised concerning him, and has appointed him ruler over Israel, my lord will not have on his conscience the staggering burden of needless bloodshed or of having avenged himself. And when the Lord has brought my lord success, remember your servant." David was utterly stunned. Her words were like cool water on the fire of his rage. He looked at this woman, prostrate in the dust before him and saw not just a petitioner, but a prophetess. She had shown him the reflection of his own soul, revealing the ugly, vengeful path he was on and illuminating the brighter road of a king who keeps his hands clean for a divine purpose. The fury drained out of him, replaced by a profound sense of awe and relief. He said to her, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, who has sent you today to meet me. May you be blessed for your good judgment, and for keeping me from bloodshed this day, and from avenging myself with my own hands. Otherwise, as surely as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, who has kept me from harming you, if you had not come quickly to meet me, not one male belonging to Nabal would have been left alive by daybreak." He accepted her gift and gave her his blessing. "Go home in peace," he said, his voice now gentle. "I have heard your words and granted your request." Abigail returned home. The crisis was averted. She found Nabal still feasting, as drunk and oblivious as a king, so she wisely said nothing. The next morning, when the wine had worn off, she told him everything. She recounted his foolish insult, David's murderous rage, the 400 swords that were descending on their household, and how she had intercepted them and turned away their wrath. As Nabal listened, the color drained from his face. The reality of his near obliteration, a catastrophe born entirely of his own arrogance, crashed down upon him. The Bible says his heart failed him, and he became like a stone. He suffered a massive stroke or heart attack. For 10 days he lingered, a living statue, until the Lord struck him down, and he died. When news of Nabal's death reached David in the wilderness, he praised God once more, not for the death of his enemy, but for his own deliverance from sin. "Praise be to the Lord," he said, "who has upheld my cause against Nabal for treating me with contempt. He has kept his servant from doing wrong, and has brought Nabal's wrongdoing down on his own head." And then, remembering the wisdom, courage, and beauty of the woman who had saved him from himself, he sent his messengers to Carmel one more time. They came to Abigail, not with a request for provisions, but with a proposal from their Lord. David wanted to take her as his wife. Abigail, with the same humility she had shown on the road, bowed with her face to the ground and said, "I am your servant, and am ready to serve you and wash the feet of my Lord's servants." She quickly got ready, and accompanied by her 5 female attendants, went with David's messengers and became his wife. The wisdom of Carmel had found its rightful home, not in the house of a fool, but at the side of a future king. The woman at the well, the road from Judea to Galilee, is a journey of dust and hills. Most devout Jews of that time would take the long way around, a winding detour east of the Jordan River. They would add days to their travel simply to avoid setting foot in the land that lay between, the scorned region of Samaria. The Samaritans were a mixed people, their bloodlines and their religion seen by the Jews as a tainted, corrupted version of the real thing. They were cousins in faith, but centuries of political and religious conflict had curdled the relationship into a bitter, simmering animosity. To a Jew, A Samaritan was a heretic, an outcast, perpetually unclean. But Jesus was not like most Jews. He took the direct route, the road that cut straight through the heart of the contested land. He and his disciples had been walking since dawn, and by the time they approached the Samaritan town of Sychar, the sun was high and merciless in the sky. It was the 6th hour, midday, a time when the heat beat down with a physical weight, silencing the birds and sending any sensible person into the cool shade of their home. Near the town lay a piece of land heavy with history, a plot that the patriarch Jacob had given to his son Joseph centuries before. And on that land was a well dug by Jacob's own hands. It was more than a source of water. It was a deep, stone-lined artery connecting the present to the sacred past. Weary from the journey, Jesus sat down by the edge of the well while his disciples, their stomachs rumbling, went on into the town to buy food. Alone, Jesus waited in the shimmering heat. Soon, a solitary figure appeared on the path from the town. It was a woman, walking with a steady, practiced gait, a large water jar balanced on her shoulder. Her presence at the well at this hour was, in itself, a story. The women of the village would have come for water in the cool of the morning or the evening, a time of social gathering, of chatter and shared work. To come alone at noon, in the full force of the heat, suggested a woman who was not welcome in their company, a woman who preferred the sun's glare to the glare of her neighbors. She approached the well, her eyes cast down, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who wants to finish their task and retreat into anonymity. She was a Samaritan. He was a Jew. She was a woman. He was a man, and a rabbi at that. By the strict social codes of their day, they might as well have been on different planets. A conversation between them was unthinkable, a breach of multiple, deeply ingrained taboos. The woman began to unloop the rope for her jar, her movements economical, her focus entirely on the task. She was aware of the man sitting there, of course, a Jewish man, a stranger, resting by her village well. Her internal shields were up, her face a mask of indifference. Then he spoke. "Will you give me a drink?" The woman froze, her hand on the rope. She looked up at him fully for the first time. His request was simple, yet it was so loaded with social dynamite that it shocked her. A Jew was asking her, a Samaritan woman, for a drink, willingly offering to make himself ritually unclean by using her jar. Her surprise quickly sharpened into a guarded, cynical curiosity. She looked him over. He was clearly tired, his face dusty from the road, but his eyes held a calm intensity she had never seen before. Her reply came out laced with the sarcasm that had become her primary defense against the world. "You are a Jew, and I am a Samaritan woman," she said, a challenge in her voice. "How can you ask me for a drink?" Jesus looked at her, his gaze cutting through her layers of hardened defiance. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he opened a door to a completely different conversation. "If you knew the gift of God," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "and who it is that asks you for a drink, you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman blinked. The conversation had just taken a bizarre turn. Living water. The phrase could mean fresh, running water, like from a spring, as opposed to the still, stagnant water at the bottom of a cistern. But his tone suggested something more. She looked at the deep, ancient well, and then back at this stranger who had no rope, no bucket, nothing to draw with. Her sarcasm returned, now mixed with genuine bewilderment. "Sir," she said, a hint of patronizing pity in her voice, "you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where can you get this living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did also his sons and his livestock?" It was a logical, earthy retort. She was grounding his lofty, spiritual language in the practical reality of their situation. "You can't even get to the water we have, so how can you offer me a better kind? Are you claiming to be more important than our shared patriarch, Jacob?" Jesus met her skepticism with a profound and beautiful promise. "Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again," he said, gesturing to the well. "But whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. Indeed, the water I give them will become in them a spring of water, welling up to eternal life." The woman fell silent. His words resonated with a deep, unnamed ache within her. Never thirst again. For a woman who had to haul a heavy jar to this well every day under a punishing sun, the words had a literal appeal. But on a deeper level, she understood he was speaking of a different kind of thirst. The thirst of a soul that had been disappointed, a heart that had been broken, a life that felt empty and repetitive. She had tried to quench that thirst in many ways, and all of them had left her emptier than before. Her sarcasm finally dissolved, replaced by a raw, sudden yearning. She didn't fully understand what he was offering, but she knew she wanted it. "Sir," she said, her voice now stripped of all irony, "give me this water so that I won't get thirsty and have to keep coming here to draw water." It was the turning point. She had asked. Now that her heart was open, Jesus gently pushed on the door, moving from the spiritual to the deeply personal. "Go," he said, "call your husband and come back." The request was like a bucket of cold water. Her past, the very reason she came to the well alone at noon, had just been dragged into the light. Her defenses snapped back into place. Her reply was clipped, evasive. "I have no husband," she said. It was the truth, but not the whole truth. "You are right when you say you have no husband," Jesus replied, his voice still gentle, without a hint of judgment. "The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man you now have is not your husband. What you have just said is quite true." The woman stared at him, her heart pounding in her chest. The heat of the day was nothing compared to the flush of exposure that washed over her. He knew. This stranger, this Jewish rabbi, knew her shameful, messy story. He saw the string of broken relationships, the desperate choices, the current compromise that left her an object of scorn in the village. But the way he said it, there was no condemnation in his voice, only a quiet statement of fact. He wasn't shamming her. He was simply showing her that he saw her. All of her. Her mind reeled. Who was this man? Her cynical dismissal of him evaporated, replaced by a dawning sense of awe and fear. "Sir," she stammered, "I can see that you are a prophet." Now that he had established his authority, she immediately pivoted to the great, unresolved argument between their peoples. Perhaps as a way to deflect the conversation from her own uncomfortable life. "Our ancestors worshipped on this mountain," she said, gesturing toward Mount Gerizim, the holy site of the Samaritans. "But you Jews claim that the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem." It was the ultimate theological debate, the source of centuries of hatred. Where is the correct place to find God? On our mountain or yours? Jesus' answer transcended the entire argument, lifting her perspective from geography to theology. "Woman," he said, and the address was one of respect, "believe me, a time is coming when you will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in the Spirit and in truth, for they are the kind of worshippers the Father seeks. God is Spirit, and his worshippers must worship in the Spirit and in truth." He was telling her that the old arguments were becoming obsolete. God was not confined to a building or a mountain. True connection with the divine was not about location, but orientation. It was an internal matter of the heart, a relationship rooted in spiritual reality and honesty. The woman was overwhelmed. This conversation, which began with a simple request for water, had collapsed into the deepest mysteries of God. She felt she was out of her depth. She fell back on the hope of her people. "I know that Messiah is coming," she said, almost to herself. "When he comes, he will explain everything to us." Jesus looked at her, his gaze steady and full of a power that seemed to vibrate in the hot, still air. He had led her on a journey from suspicion to curiosity, from yearning to exposure, from theological debate to the brink of the ultimate revelation. Now, he took the final step. "I, the one speaking to you," he said quietly, "am he." At that very moment, his disciples returned from the town, their arms laden with food. They stopped short, shocked. They saw Jesus locked in conversation with a Samaritan woman, a flagrant violation of custom. But none of them dared to question him. They saw the intensity of the moment, the strange, holy atmosphere that had settled around the well. For the woman, the world had been remade. The disciples, the food, the social rules, none of it mattered. Leaving her water jar behind, a forgotten relic of her old life and its burdens, she turned and ran back toward the town. She was no longer the silent outcast seeking to avoid notice. She was a witness, bursting with a message she could not contain. She ran into the marketplace, to the very people she had avoided. "Come," she cried out, her voice ringing with an astonishing new authority. "See a man who told me everything I ever did. Could this be the Messiah?" Her testimony was electric. It was not a polished sermon, but a raw, personal, and irresistible invitation. Her own transformation was the most powerful evidence. The townspeople, who knew her and her story, saw the change in her face, heard the conviction in her voice, and were intrigued. Spurred by her words, they left their homes and their shops and streamed out of the town toward the well to see this man for themselves. Many of them came to believe, first because of the woman's testimony, and then after they invited Jesus to stay with them for 2 days because of his own words. "We no longer believe just because of what you said," they told the woman. "Now we have heard for ourselves, and we know that this man really is the Savior of the world." The outcast had become an evangelist. The woman who came to the well seeking to quench a physical thirst found the living water that quenched the deepest thirst of her soul. And in doing so, she brought her entire community to the source, proving that the most profound encounters with God can happen in the most unexpected places, at the most unlikely times, to the most improbable people. The parable of the little lamb. The king was at peace. A year had passed since the season of war, the time when kings go off to battle. But King David, his throne secure and his kingdom prosperous, had remained in Jerusalem. He had sent his loyal general, Joab, and the army to fight his battles for him, while he enjoyed the comforts of his palace. From its rooftop, he had seen a woman of breathtaking beauty, and what the king wanted, the king took. Her name was Bathsheba. That she was the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers, Uriah the Hittite, was an obstacle David's power could easily sweep aside. One act of covetousness led to another of deceit. When Bathsheba sent word that she was pregnant with his child, David's peaceful reign was threatened by scandal. He summoned Uriah from the battlefield, hoping the soldier would sleep with his wife, thus providing a convenient cover for the child's paternity. But Uriah was a man of impeccable honor. He refused to enjoy the comforts of his home and his wife, while his comrades, the Ark of the Covenant, and his commander Joab were camped in open fields. He slept on the steps of the palace, a silent, powerful rebuke to the king's own indulgence. Frustrated, David's plotting turned from deceit to murder. He sent Uriah back to the front lines with a sealed letter for Joab. It was a death sentence. The letter instructed Joab to place Uriah at the forefront of the fiercest fighting, and then to withdraw the troops from around him, leaving him exposed and certain to be killed. Joab, ever the king's loyal instrument, obeyed. Uriah the Hittite, a man of profound integrity, was cut down by Ammonite swords, a victim not of the enemy, but of his own king's lust and treachery. After Bathsheba's period of mourning was over, David brought her to the palace, and she became his wife. A son was born to them. The matter, it seemed, was settled. The king had what he wanted. The scandal was contained, the murder hidden beneath the fog of war. The psalmist king, the man said to be after God's own heart, had wrapped himself in a cloak of impunity and settled back into the rhythms of power. The Bible notes this chapter with a chilling finality. But the thing David had done displeased the Lord. Into this carefully constructed piece walked a man who feared God more than he feared any king. His name was Nathan. He was a prophet, a man whose role was to be the conscience of the kingdom, to speak heaven's truth to earthly power. He sought an audience with the king and was granted it immediately. David, who had long valued Nathan's counsel, likely expected a word from the Lord about state affairs or the ongoing war. Nathan entered the royal chamber, a simple man in woolen robes, his face weathered, his eyes holding a deep and ancient sorrow. He bowed before the king, who sat on his throne, a picture of majesty and control. "I have a story I must tell you, my lord," Nathan began, his voice even. "There is a matter of injustice in your kingdom that requires your judgment." David leaned forward, his interest piqued. As king, he was the supreme judge of the land, the final arbiter of right and wrong. "Speak," he commanded. Nathan began his story, his voice painting a vivid picture for the king. "There were two men in a certain town," he said, "one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, more than he could ever count. His wealth was a great sea of livestock, and his table never lacked for the finest roasted meat. The poor man," Nathan continued, his voice softening, "had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his meager food, drank from his own cup, and even slept in his arms. It was not like an animal to him. It was like a daughter." David, a man who had been a shepherd boy himself, listened intently. He could picture the scene perfectly, the hardscrabble life of the poor man, and the tender, familial bond with this one precious animal. Nathan's storytelling was masterful, drawing the king into the emotional heart of the tale. "Now a traveler came to the rich man," Nathan went on, "and the rich man was unwilling to take one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. He did not want to diminish his own vast flock by even a single head." Nathan paused, letting the injustice of it settle in the air. "Instead," he said, his voice hardening, "he took the poor man's lamb, the one that was like a daughter to him, and he prepared it for the man who had come to him." The story ended. A silence fell over the chamber. David's face, which had been softened by the tale of the poor man's love, was now contorted with a furious rage. His sense of justice, so keen when applied to others, erupted like a volcano. He shot to his feet, his fists clenched. "As surely as the Lord lives," he roared, his voice thundering in the chamber, "the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did this thing and had no pity." He stood there, magnificent in his righteous anger, a king defending the powerless, a champion of the oppressed. He had pronounced judgment, swift and absolute. He looked at Nathan, expecting a nod of agreement, a confirmation that they would find this wicked man and bring him to justice. But Nathan did not nod. He simply stood his ground, his sorrowful eyes fixed on the king. He let David's furious words hang in the air, echoing off the stone walls. Then, in the ringing silence that followed, Nathan raised a single, trembling finger, pointed it directly at the king's heart, and spoke 4 words that shattered the world. "You are the man." Time stopped. The air rushed out of David's lungs. The sound in the chamber seemed to warp and distort. The prophet's words were not an accusation, they were a mirror. And in it, David saw not the righteous king, but the monstrous reflection of the rich man in the story. The carefully constructed walls of his denial, built over months of willful ignorance, came crashing down in an instant. Nathan's voice, no longer telling a story, but delivering a divine indictment, pressed on, relentlessly laying bare the king's sin. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I anointed you king over Israel, and I delivered you from the hand of Saul. I gave you your master's house and your master's wives into your arms. I gave you all Israel and Judah, and if all this had been too little, I would have given you even more." Every word was a hammer blow, reminding David of the immense grace and favor God had poured out upon him. "Why did you despise the word of the Lord by doing what is evil in his eyes?" Nathan demanded, his voice rising with the passion of divine grief. "You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword and took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. The secret was out. The sin was named. The murder he thought was hidden was laid bare before the throne of heaven. There was no escape, no excuse, no corner of his soul left to hide in. Then came the sentence. It was not the death penalty David had so righteously pronounced upon the rich man. It was something more intimate, more agonizing, a judgment that would poison the very heart of his family and his kingdom. "Now, therefore," Nathan declared, his voice heavy with the weight of prophecy, "the sword will never depart from your house, because you despised me and took the wife of Uriah the Hittite to be your own. Out of your own household I am going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who is close to you, and he will sleep with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret, but I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." The king, the warrior, the giant slayer, crumpled. All the strength went out of him. He sank back onto his throne, no longer a king, but a sinner, exposed and broken. The fury was gone, replaced by a wave of horrifying, soul-crushing guilt. The rich man's crime was his crime. The stolen lamb was Bathsheba. No, the stolen lamb was Uriah, the loyal, honorable man he had treated like a disposable animal. There were no excuses, no attempts to justify his actions or minimize his guilt. The prophet's parable had bypassed his defenses and pierced his conscience. All he could do was confess. He looked at Nathan, his eyes filled with tears, his voice a choked whisper. "I have sinned against the Lord." It was a simple, profound admission. In that moment of true repentance, Nathan's demeanor softened. The searing fire of judgment gave way to the difficult news of mercy. "The Lord has taken away your sin," Nathan said quietly. "You are not going to die. But because by doing this, you have shown utter contempt for the Lord, the son born to you will die." It was a terrible, heartbreaking consequence, a living reminder that while sin can be forgiven, its wounds often leave deep and lasting scars. Nathan turned and left the palace, his grim duty done. David was left alone in the echoing silence of his chamber, stripped of his pride, his peace shattered. He was a forgiven man, but he was also a man who would now live with the devastating consequences of his actions. The sword, as Nathan had prophesied, would indeed haunt his house for the rest of his days, through the rebellion of his beloved son Absalom and the treachery of others. The king who had everything had risked it all for a moment of stolen pleasure, and in the process had inflicted a wound on his own soul and his own family that would never fully heal. The parable of the little lamb was over, but its tragic truth would echo through the rest of his reign. The cracks in the kiln. The world was young again, washed clean by the great flood. The descendants of Noah spread out, and the memory of the water was a deep and persistent tremor in their collective soul. They were one people. From the mountains of Ararat to the fertile crescent of the two great rivers, they spoke a single language. The words for water, sky, love, and fear were the same on every tongue. This unity was their strength. A thought conceived in one mind could be perfectly understood by all. A plan laid by one could be executed by thousands without a single misinterpretation. It was a world of seamless communication, a vast, interconnected family. As they journeyed from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar. It was a wide, flat expanse of rich, alluvial soil, a perfect canvas for a new beginning. The sky was immense, a deep blue bowl that stretched from horizon to horizon, unbroken by any mountain. Here they settled. The memory of the flood, however, did not just inspire awe, it bred a deep-seated fear, and fear, when mixed with ambition, can curdle into pride. A man named Nimrod, a mighty hunter and a leader of men, rose to prominence among them. He was a man who saw the world not as a gift to be stewarded, but as a resource to be conquered. He looked at the scattered settlements, the humble villages of mud and reed, and saw not community, but inefficiency. He looked at the vast, empty sky, and saw not the glory of God, but a challenge. "Come," he declared one day in the great assembly, his voice booming with a charismatic certainty. "Let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." It was a revolution in technology. Until then, they had built with sun-dried mud and uncut stone, their structures temporary and vulnerable. The kiln, a roaring furnace that transformed soft clay into hard, durable brick, was a symbol of their mastery over the elements. It was a way of saying, we will not be subject to the whims of nature. We will make our own stone stronger and more uniform than any rock. His vision was infectious. A great fervor swept through the people. They saw in his words a way to banish their fear, to build a defense not just against floodwaters, but against insignificance. "Let us build ourselves a city," Nimrod continued, his voice rising, "with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." This was the true heart of the project. It was born of a desire for fame, make a name for ourselves, and a fear of dispersal, lest we be scattered. They sought to replace God's command to fill the earth with their own mandate to concentrate their power, to create a man-made center for humanity. The tower was not to be a place of worship reaching up to God, but a monument to their own unity and strength, a symbol of defiance reaching for the heavens. The work began. The plain of Shinar became a vast construction site, a marvel of human cooperation. The air filled with the rhythmic chant of workers, the slap of wet clay into molds, and the roar of the great kilns that glowed day and night. The unity of their language was the engine of their progress. An architect on a high scaffold could shout a complex instruction, and 1,000 hands below would move as one to obey. There were no misunderstandings, no delays, no need for translation. They were a single, magnificent machine, and the tower was its product. An old man named Elam, whose grandfather had told him stories of the great ark, watched the work with a growing disquiet in his heart. He saw the technical brilliance, the incredible effort, but he also saw the look in the people's eyes. It was not the humble satisfaction of good work, but a glint of arrogant pride. He watched as they used bitumen, a black, sticky tar for mortar, a substance that made their brickwork impervious to water. It was a subtle but clear act of defiance, a statement that they would never again be vulnerable to a flood. Elam approached Zachar, the chief architect of the tower, a young, brilliant man consumed by the project. "Zachar," he said, his voice a low rumble against the noise of the site, "what is it truly that we are building?" Zachar turned from his parchments, his eyes alight with fervor. "We are building permanence, old man. We are building a name that will outlast the mountains. We are building a fist to shake at the sky. When our children's children look upon this tower, they will know that we were masters of the earth, united and powerful. We will decide our own destiny. And where is God in this destiny?" Elam asked quietly. Zachar scoffed. "God gave us the minds to design the kiln and the hands to lay the brick. He clearly wants us to use them. He blessed our unity. We are simply perfecting it, giving it a worthy monument. We are ensuring we will never be scattered, weak, and alone again. But he commanded us to scatter," Elam persisted, "to fill the earth. We are building a fortress against his very command. We are not perfecting unity, we are idolizing it. We have stopped worshiping the one who made us, and we have started worshiping the us that we have made." Zachar turned away, his patience gone. "Your fears are the fears of a bygone age, Elam. This is a new world, and we are its new masters." The tower grew. It rose from the plain like a finger pointing at the heavens, a colossal structure of baked brick and black mortar. It cast a long shadow over the city that sprawled at its base. The higher it climbed, the the more the pride of the people swelled. They would sing songs not of praise to God, but of praise to themselves, to the work of their own hands. Their single language became a vessel for a single arrogant thought. We are as gods. Up in the heavens, the Lord looked down. He saw the city and the tower that the children of men were building. He saw their unity, a gift he had given them, now twisted into a tool of rebellion. He heard their one language, intended for communion, now used to articulate a single, defiant purpose. And the Lord said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." It was not a statement of admiration, but of profound concern. Humanity, in its pride, was setting itself on a course of limitless ambition, unchecked by humility or reverence. They were attempting to usurp his place, to engineer their own salvation and secure their own glory. This path, he knew, did not lead to greatness, but to self-destruction. The project had to be stopped, not merely for his own honor, but for their own good. "Come," God said, "let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other." The judgment was not fire or flood. It was something far more subtle and profound. It was not a destruction of their bodies, but a deconstruction of their understanding. The next morning, the sun rose on the plain of Shinar, as it always had. The workers gathered at the foot of the tower, ready for another day of glorious labor. The foreman, a man named Hezron, stood on a low wall to give the day's instructions. He opened his mouth and spoke the familiar words for you men. "Take the bricks to the western scaffold. You mix the mortar." But the words that came out were alien. They were a stream of sounds that no one had ever heard before, full of guttural stops and soft, liquid vowels. The men stared at him, their faces a mixture of confusion and alarm. Hezron, seeing their blank looks, repeated himself, shouting now, his voice laced with frustration. The sounds were still gibberish. One of the masons shouted back, "What are you saying? Speak clearly." But his own words came out in yet another new tongue, a lilting, musical language that was unintelligible to everyone around him. Panic began to ripple through the crowd. A man turned to his brother, a man he had worked beside his entire life, and tried to ask what was happening. But the sounds he made were harsh and clipped, and his brother responded in a flowing, breathy speech. They looked at each other in terror. The bond between them, the effortless understanding that had defined their entire existence, was gone. The chaos spread like wildfire. A cry for water was heard as a demand for brick. An instruction to hold was heard as an order to drop. A load of bricks, meant for a high scaffold, came crashing down, narrowly missing a group of workers who scattered, shouting at each other in a dozen different, newly born languages. The perfect machine had broken down. The single, unified mind had shattered into 1,000 competing, isolated fragments. Zachar, the architect, stood on a platform, waving his parchments, his face red with rage and confusion, screaming instructions that no one could understand. Elam, the elder, stood at a distance, watching the pandemonium, and he began to weep, not with joy at his own vindication, but with sorrow for the brokenness of his people. The work on the tower stopped. It was impossible to continue. How could they build when they could not speak? How could they cooperate when they could not communicate? The project, born of a desire to prevent them from being scattered, now became the very reason for their scattering. Frustration gave way to suspicion, and suspicion gave way to fear. People began to cluster with the few others who made the same strange new sounds they did. These small groups, bound by a shared, sudden language, looked upon the other groups with distrust. They could no longer understand each other's motives or intentions. This stranger, who was yesterday my brother, is now a foreigner, a potential enemy, and so they began to leave. Family by family, clan by clan, language by language, they packed their belongings and abandoned the city and its great, unfinished monument to pride. They scattered over the face of the whole earth, just as they had feared, their great unity broken into 100 vibrant and often conflicting cultures. The city was left half-finished, and the tower stood incomplete, a jagged tooth on the horizon, a testament not to the glory of man, but to the folly of pride. They called the place Babel from the Hebrew word Babel, meaning to confuse. Because it was there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. It stood for generations, a silent, crumbling reminder that true unity is not found in a single voice or a single tower, but in a shared humility before the one who holds all languages and all peoples in his hands.